This is the largest financial experiment in human history, and most people don't realize they're living inside it. Global debt, public, private, household, corporate, has surged to levels no civilization has ever carried. Governments borrow trillions as if it were trivial. Central banks conjure currency with keystrokes. Families sign 30-year mortgages with the same nonchalance as buying groceries. And still, we speak as if debt were normal, harmless, and permanent. The uncomfortable truth is that debt has always been a tool of power, a weapon of control, and a ticking clock waiting for the right spark. The real question isn't whether today's mountain of obligations will trigger a crisis, but when and who will pay when the system resets. To grasp how we arrived here, trace debt back to its roots. Debt is as old as settled life. The earliest Mesopotamian clay tablets millennia before Christ weren't poems or philosophy. They were ledgers. They recorded who owed whom, how much grain, how many animals. In early societies, debt wasn't merely economic, it was sacred. Priests and kings oversaw balances, enforced judgments, and sometimes forgave them outright in sweeping jubilees to prevent social breakdown. Imagine that for a moment. The survival of society requiring a periodic reset of the financial scoreboard. Debt conferred power, but excessive debt threatened stability. Ancient rulers understood what modern leaders pretend to forget. You cannot bind an entire population with obligations forever. Eventually, the structure cracks. By the way, if you love money, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now let's continue. Leap to the Renaissance and the ascent of banking families like the Medici of Florence. Debt evolved from grain and cattle to coin and credit. Kings and popes borrowed vast sums to wage wars, raise cathedrals, and extend empires. But every credit line carried risk. Spain, awash in silver from the New World, slid into bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century because the crown borrowed beyond its means. Lesson 1. Even empires stuffed with treasure can drown when ambition outruns reality. Debt was no longer just personal, it was geopolitical. It fueled wars, toppled dynasties, and redrew maps. The truly modern explosion began in the 20th century. After the First World War, nations staggered under debt so large repayment seemed fantastical. Germany was chained to reparations under the Treaty of Versailles obligations, so punitive that economists warned they would destabilize the nation. They were right. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s, wheelbarrows of paper marks for bread flowed from promises that could not be honored in real terms. The trauma scarred politics and helped set the stage for an even darker conflict. Debt wasn't an accounting quirk. It was the fuel of chaos. Then came 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. There, the financial architecture of the post-war world was engineered. The United States, holding the bulk of the world's gold, set the rules. The dollar became the anchor, convertible to gold at 35 per ounce. Other currencies pegged to the dollar. The plan promised stability. The effect was dependence. Every nation's debts and bonds rested on the belief that America would maintain discipline. For a time, the system held. But the temptation to borrow, to spend beyond one's means, never disappears. By the 196s and into the 1970s, with the costs of the Vietnam War and ambitious social programs, the United States issued more dollars than it held in gold. Foreign governments noticed and demanded metal for paper. In 1971, President Richard Nixon slammed the window shut. The dollar severed its link with gold. Debt floated free. Governments could borrow and print at will, limited only by confidence and the patience of creditors. That 1971 break was a quiet revolution. Debt shifted from finite to elastic. Without gold, central banks discovered they could steer economies by moving the price of money. When growth slowed, rates were cut to encourage borrowing. When crises erupted, new credit was created to plug the hole. Each rescue required more leverage than the last. The 1980s brought large public debt expansions under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, justified by defense and deregulation. Developing nations borrowed heavily from Western banks, igniting the Latin American debt crisis when revenues couldn't cover interest. The pattern calcified. Use debt to chase prosperity, then drown when the tide recedes. The 2008 crisis was not merely about housing. It was about debt stacked upon debt. a pyramid so tall that when one corner chipped, the structure shuddered. Mortgages were bundled into securities, sold around the world, insured with derivatives, and magnified by leverage ratios of 30 to 1. When the edifice cracked, banks failed, pensions shrank, and governments intervened with trillions. Bitter irony followed. Reckless institutions were rescued. Ordinary people absorbed unemployment, foreclosures, and austerity. Debt revealed itself not as a neutral instrument, but as a system calibrated to protect the powerful. Since then, the numbers have become surreal. Global debt roughly tripled in 2 decades, surpassing $300 trillion by 2023, nearly 4 times the size of the world economy. Governments, corporations, and households all piled on. Some countries like Japan now carry public debts exceeding 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions annually with barely a debate. Many emerging markets borrow in foreign currencies, inviting crisis when the dollar strengthens and rates rise. Stability now depends on the belief that leverage can expand forever without consequence. But debt always extracts a price. It distorts behavior, inflates bubbles, shifts wealth, and mortgages the future. Every dollar borrowed today stakes a claim on tomorrow's work. When the sums swell beyond reason, honest repayment becomes fantasy. That is why history is littered with restructurings, inflations, and defaults. Debts end in 3 ways. You pay, you debase, or you refuse. No empire, no order has escaped that arithmetic. The present-day effects are everywhere, though largely invisible. When your government runs a deficit, it doesn't knock on your door. It issues bonds, sells them to banks and foreign funds, and quietly builds a tab in your name. When you swipe a credit card, you are not paying, you are borrowing. When corporations tout record profits, those numbers are often juiced by borrowed money, used to buy back stock and compress share counts. The system thrives on leverage. Leverage is like gravity. It feels weightless on the ascent and crushing on the fall. Finance today floats on promises that may not be kept. Consider the United States, anchor of the current order. Its gross federal debt pushed past $34 trillion in 2024. The number is so large it becomes abstract. Translate it. Every taxpayer shoulders a claim worth hundreds of thousands. Interest costs now rival defense spending. The superpower borrows simply to pay interest on earlier borrowing. Europe rhymes. Debt to GDP ratios sit above 100% in countries like Italy and Greece. In China, the explosion is camouflaged in local financing vehicles and state-owned enterprises, creating shadow liabilities that may dwarf official tallies. Everywhere, debt has metastasized. The trap is psychological as much as financial. Politicians adore debt because it buys time. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers more. Borrowing feels painless. Future people will deal with it. The illusion works until it doesn't, until interest rates rise and the burden suddenly becomes visible. That is exactly what the world saw beginning in 2022 as central banks tightened to fight inflation. Servicing costs surged. Governments faced narrower budgets. Households saw mortgage payments jump. Firms watch refinancing expenses balloon. Debt is a sleeping predator, harmless at rest, deadly when awake. Even as risks mount, debt continues to be sold as a path to prosperity. Students are told to take on tens of thousands for degrees that may or may not pay. Families are urged to stretch for homes near the edge of affordability because housing never goes down. Nations are assured deficits don't matter because central banks can print. That is the great lie of modern finance. Debt is free, infinite, and safe. History shouts the opposite, and every cycle eventually makes that shout impossible to ignore. What comes next is not hard to foresee if you study the past. When obligations outrun reason, only a few exits exist. One is inflation, silently shrinking the real value of what's owed by debasing currency. It is already present. If prices rise 10%, your savings lose 10% of power, but your government's burden shrinks by the same margin. Inflation operates as a hidden tax and is politically easier than overt default. The second exit is restructuring admitting debts can't be repaid and renegotiating terms. Greece provided the modern template, with bondholders forced to accept losses. The third is outright default refusing to pay at all. History is dotted with sovereign collapses. From Russia to Argentina, each unleashing turmoil. None is painless. All represent a broken promise. So, which way are we headed? The signs point toward inflation as the preferred route. Central banks can posture as hawks, but governments heavy with obligations need erosion of real value to survive. That means ordinary citizens carry the cost. Your wages, your savings, your future purchasing power drained to preserve the structure. It is the oldest trick in the book. People accept it because inflation creeps, the numbers are abstract, and the system trains us to believe debt is someone else's problem. Here is the final insight. Debt is not purely about economics. It is about power. Who lends, who borrows, who gets rescued when things crumble. The architecture is designed so that when burdens become unbearable, the powerful rarely pay. Banks are bailed out. Corporations restructure, politicians retire. Ordinary people lose homes, jobs, and time they cannot recover. Understanding debt is not optional financial literacy. It is survival. If you don't spot the trap, you live inside it, shackled by promises you never made. What then should you do? First, strip away illusions. Debt is not neutral. Every borrowed dollar has a consequence. Second, learn the pattern. No empire, no nation, no system escapes a reckoning. Timelines vary, destinations rhyme. Third, protect yourself. That does not mean panic or burying gold in the backyard. It means building resilient wealth not held hostage by paper promises. Favor assets that can hold value across cycles. Invest in skills and knowledge that compound regardless of policy swings. Keep perspective so you don't fall for recycled tricks, because the system will repeat them, because the cycle repeats. Debt grows, leaders deny, crises erupt, societies reset. Your only choice is whether you enter that pattern blind or awake. If you see the traps, you can sidestep them. If you don't, you will pay for mistakes you never made. Global debt is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a long shadow over the future. If this gave you a new lens, subscribe. History holds the answers, if you know where to look. And that's what we do here. Decode the past to navigate the present. Think of the system as a vast machine calibrated to grow on credit. Low rates are the grease, collateral is the belt, confidence is the electricity. When the motor hums, everyone forgets the power source is borrowed time. When the current flickers, the gears grind, and managers reach for the only repair kit they trust. Cheaper money, looser terms, bigger programs. Each fix cannibalizes the future to feed the present. That bargain can run for years, but not forever. Look closely at the rescue playbook. Lower rates, buy assets, guarantee markets, subsidize credit. Each move pushes investors out the risk curve, inflates valuations, and widens gaps between those who own assets and those who sell time. When the next shock hits, the baseline is higher, the cushion thinner, the appetite for pain smaller. The system grows more fragile even as the indices rise. That is what it means to drift toward a regime that cannot tolerate normal volatility. This is not a call for despair. It is a call for clarity. Understand the currents you swim in. Hold some claims that are not someone else's liability. Keep a margin of safety. Avoid the siren song of easy credit that pledges tomorrow's freedom for today's convenience. Vote for leaders who tell fiscal truths instead of bedtime stories. Teach your children how compounding works both ways, on savings and on debts. None of that will stop the cycle, but it will change your position within it. The ending arrives by choice or by force. Choice looks like discipline, slower spending, productive investment, credible budgets, incentives that favor building over speculation. Force looks like inflation, crisis, capital flight, and political upheaval. The pivot is decided by culture as much as by spreadsheets. Do we prefer quick fixes or durable repairs? Do we celebrate rent-seeking or value creation? These questions shape the path as surely as any central bank dial. And yet, there is agency. Households can choose buffers over bravado. Firms can choose cash flow over cosmetic buybacks. Citizens can demand transparency and consequences. Small choices accumulate. They may not bend the global line overnight, but they can widen your personal margin between shock and ruin. In a world built on leverage, margin is freedom. So, Yes, this is the largest financial experiment ever run. Its ingredients are familiar: low rates, high promises, a belief that clever policy can outrun arithmetic. Its outcome is unwritten. The thesis of history is plain, but the plot twists are ours to author. See the machine, respect its power, beware its cost, and above all, refuse to be the last to notice that the bill has come due. Be awake now. If you made it this far, drop a plus in the comments your badge for finishing the deep dive. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form stories where money, history, and power collide. Curious about earlier empires of capital? Check out our others video.